The Ardennes Forest, Belgium, December 1944. The greatest American military disaster of the war was unfolding in frozen darkness, and everyone knew it. This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the tank commander who Patton himself called the best in the entire army, the officer whose battalion Germans tracked by name, and the man who led from inside a Sherman tank while generals commanded from chateaus miles behind the fighting. 3 days before Christmas, 1944, the American front had collapsed. 200,000 German soldiers had smashed through thinly defended lines in the Ardennes, creating a massive bulge in Allied positions that threatened to split the American and British armies in half. The Germans were racing toward the Meuse River and the vital port of Antwerp. If they succeeded, they could trap hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers and force a negotiated peace. The war that everyone thought was almost won suddenly looked like it might end in catastrophic defeat. At the center of this disaster sat the town of Bastogne. It was a crossroads town, a hub where 7 major roads converged in the frozen Belgian countryside. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement in the entire region. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to the town in open trucks without winter clothing, now found themselves completely surrounded by German forces. 18,000 American paratroopers faced 50,000 German soldiers with tanks, artillery, and orders to take Bastogne at any cost. The Germans demanded surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gave his famous one-word reply, "Nuts." The defiance made great headlines, but defiance doesn't stop tanks or feed starving soldiers. The 101st was running out of ammunition, running out of food, running out of medical supplies for their wounded. Low clouds prevented air resupply. The temperature dropped below zero. Men froze to death in their foxholes. Without relief, the entire division would be destroyed, and with it, any hope of stopping the German offensive. General George Patton promised he could turn his entire Third Army 90 degrees and attack north into the German flank within 48 hours. It was an audacious claim that most military experts considered impossible. Armies don't simply pivot and attack in different directions overnight. But Patton was known for audacious claims and theatrical promises. He had built his entire reputation on bold statements and dramatic gestures. What Patton didn't mention was who would actually lead that attack. Not Patton himself, who would be coordinating from his headquarters in Luxembourg, warm and safe behind layers of staff officers. The actual spearhead, the tanks that would have to drive through German forces to reach Bastogne, would be led by a cigar-chomping lieutenant colonel that most Americans had never heard of. His name was Creighton Abrams, and he commanded the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division. He was about to become the most dangerous American armor commander that German forces would ever face. To understand why Abrams was different, you first have to understand the man himself. He was born in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1914, the son of a railroad repairman. His family had no military background, no political connections, no wealth. He was not the kind of young man who typically attended West Point in the 1930s, when the officer corps was dominated by sons of privilege and legacy. But Abrams was intelligent, intensely competitive, and possessed an almost frightening determination to succeed. He talked his way into an appointment and graduated with the class of 1936. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. He was stocky with a round face and thinning hair. He spoke in a deep, gravelly voice that could make even casual conversations sound like a warning. He smoked cigars constantly, rarely removing one from the corner of his mouth even in combat. He was not charming or particularly warm. He did not give inspiring speeches or cultivate relationships with journalists. He was, in almost every way, the opposite of George Patton. Where Patton was theatrical, Abrams was methodical. Where Patton sought publicity, Abrams avoided it. Where Patton commanded from headquarters and made dramatic appearances at the front for photographs, Abrams commanded from inside his Sherman tank, leading every attack personally. His radio call sign was Thunderbolt, and his tank bore that name painted on its hull. By December 1944, he was on his 6th Thunderbolt. The previous 5 had been destroyed in combat, but Abrams himself had always survived, climbing out of burning wreckage to take command of another vehicle. His officers described him with a mixture of respect and fear. He demanded absolute competence and could not tolerate excuses. One tank commander remembered that Abrams didn't raise his voice when he was angry. Instead, his voice got quieter, which was somehow far more terrifying. He would look at you with those cold eyes and ask questions in a soft voice, and you knew that if you didn't have answers, your career was finished. But he never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Every attack, every advance, every dangerous mission, Abrams led from the front. This was almost unheard of for a battalion commander. Lieutenant colonels were supposed to coordinate from battalion headquarters, managing the big picture while subordinate officers led individual tank platoons and companies. The rationale was simple. If a battalion commander got killed leading a charge, the entire battalion could fall into chaos without leadership. But Abrams believed something different. He believed that commanders who stayed behind couldn't make the rapid decisions that tank warfare required. He believed that soldiers fought harder when they could see their commanders sharing the danger. And he believed, with cold mathematical certainty, that aggressive leadership at the front would destroy more enemy forces faster than cautious leadership from behind. He was right. By December 1944, the 37th Tank Battalion under Abrams had compiled a combat record that made staff officers blink in disbelief when they read the statistics. His battalion had destroyed or captured more German equipment than units 3 times its size. His casualty rates, while significant, were dramatically lower than what his kill ratios would suggest. He achieved results that seemed impossible because he understood something that other commanders missed. Speed and aggression were actually safer than caution when fighting armored warfare. The logic was counterintuitive but correct. If you attacked slowly and carefully, German defenders had time to prepare anti-tank positions, call in artillery, and coordinate counterattacks. If you hit them fast and hard, driving through their positions before they could react, you caught them disorganized and vulnerable. Abrams advanced so quickly that German units reported being overrun before they even knew an attack had started. His tanks appeared where German commanders didn't expect them, and German soldiers who should have been preparing defenses were instead running for their lives. The German High Command noticed. By late 1944, German intelligence had begun specifically tracking the 37th Tank Battalion, an extraordinary distinction for a single battalion among thousands in the Allied order of battle. German radio intercepts mentioned Abrams by name. Unit commanders facing the 4th Armored Division warned their subordinates specifically about the American colonel who led from the front and whose attacks came with terrifying speed. This was almost unprecedented. German intelligence normally tracked divisions and corps, not individual battalions. They tracked generals, not lieutenant colonels. But Abrams had made such an impression that German officers needed to know exactly where his battalion was at all times. When 37th Tank Battalion was identified in a sector, German defensive preparations intensified. Reserves were moved forward. Artillery was pre-registered on likely avenues of approach. The Germans prepared for Abrams the way they prepared for no other American officer below the rank of general. One captured German officer, interrogated after the war, explained it simply. Most American tank units were competent but predictable. They advanced during daylight, stopped to consolidate positions, and moved at a pace that German defenders could anticipate and prepare for. Abrams was different. He attacked at unexpected times, from unexpected directions, with unexpected ferocity. His tanks didn't stop to consolidate. They kept driving forward, deeper into German territory, creating chaos in rear areas while frontline defenders were still trying to figure out what was happening. Fighting against him was like fighting against a force of nature. You could prepare all you wanted, but when he attacked, everything fell apart anyway. This reputation preceded Abrams into the Ardennes. When German commanders learned that 4th Armored Division was turning north toward Bastogne, they understood immediately that this would not be an ordinary relief attempt. They began preparing accordingly, but they also understood that preparation against Abrams had limits. He would find a way through. He always found a way through. December 22, 1944. Patton's Third Army was beginning its turn north. The logistics were staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers, thousands of vehicles, millions of gallons of fuel and ammunition, all had to be reoriented 90 degrees while maintaining combat effectiveness. Staff officers worked through the night on movement orders. Supplies were rerouted. Units that had been attacking east were told to prepare to attack north. It was, by any measure, an impressive feat of military coordination. But the combat soldiers didn't care about logistics. They cared about the frozen roads, the German tanks, the artillery that could find them even in a blizzard. They cared about getting to Bastogne before their fellow Americans died. The 4th Armored Division began pushing north through small Belgian towns with names Americans couldn't pronounce. German resistance stiffened immediately. The Germans understood what was happening and were determined to stop it. Abrams pushed his battalion forward through a freezing fog that limited visibility to 100 yards. German anti-tank guns waited in ambush along tree lines. Every crossroads could hide a Tiger tank that would destroy Shermans before they could even see it. Other battalion commanders would have slowed down, sent reconnaissance forward, waited for infantry support. Abrams kept driving forward. His philosophy was simple: if you slow down, you die. Speed was the only protection that mattered. On December 23rd, the fog lifted briefly and American fighter bombers screamed overhead, attacking German positions ahead of Abrams's advance. He used the opportunity immediately, pushing his tanks forward while German defenders were pinned down by air attacks. His battalion covered more ground in 4 hours than other units covered in 4 days. But then the fog returned, and the aircraft disappeared, and Abrams was alone again with his tanks and his Germans. The towns fell one by one. Martelange, Bougainville. Each one cost men and machines. German defenders fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew what failure meant. Every hour that American forces were delayed was another hour for German reinforcements to strengthen the ring around Bastogne. Every American tank destroyed was one less tank available for the final push. The mathematics were brutal. Abrams was trading men and machines for distance, hoping he could break through before he ran out of either. December 25th, Christmas Day. The men of the 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne ate cold rations and listened to German artillery pounding their positions. They had been surrounded for a week. Ammunition was critically low. Medical supplies were exhausted. The wounded lay in cellars and churches, suffering without morphine, dying from wounds that would have been survivable with proper treatment. German attacks came in waves, probing for weakness, testing defensive lines that grew thinner every day. 7 miles south, Creighton Abrams sat in his tank turret studying a map by flashlight. His battalion had been in continuous combat for 3 days. His men were exhausted. His tanks were breaking down. He had lost a quarter of his vehicles to German fire and mechanical failures. But he was close. 7 miles separated his lead tanks from the perimeter of Bastogne. 7 miles of frozen terrain defended by German forces that knew exactly where he was going and were determined to stop him. The plan for December 26th was an all-out assault. Abrams would lead Combat Command Reserve of the 4th Armored Division in a direct attack on the town of Assenois, the last German strongpoint before Bastogne. Intelligence estimated significant German forces in and around the town, including anti-tank guns, infantry, and possibly armor. A conventional attack would require careful preparation, artillery bombardment, infantry support, and coordination that would take hours to arrange. Abrams didn't have hours. The men in Bastogne didn't have hours. He made a decision that would define his legend. He would attack immediately, with whatever forces he had available, leading from the front as always. There would be no artillery preparation because there wasn't time to coordinate it. There would be no infantry support because the infantry couldn't keep up with tanks. There would just be Abrams in his Sherman, leading his tankers through German positions at maximum speed, hoping that aggression and surprise could accomplish what careful planning could not. December 26, 1944, 4:45 p.m. The light was fading from the winter sky. In 90 minutes it would be dark. Abrams ordered the attack. 18 Sherman tanks rolled forward toward Assenois, engines roaring in the cold air. Abrams was in the lead tank, his turret hatch open despite the freezing temperature, scanning for targets with his binoculars. Behind him came the rest of his assault force, tanks, half-tracks carrying infantry, and armored cars for reconnaissance. They moved in a column down a road that German forces had certainly mined and definitely defended. It was exactly the kind of attack that military textbooks said you should never attempt. The first German fire came almost immediately. Anti-tank rounds screamed past the lead tanks. Machine guns opened up on the column from concealed positions in the tree lines. The natural reaction was to stop, take cover, return fire carefully. Abrams did the opposite. He ordered maximum speed. His tank lurched forward even faster, racing toward the German positions rather than away from them. The psychology of this tactic was as important as the tactics themselves. German anti-tank gunners were trained to engage tanks at long range where their weapons were most effective and their positions least vulnerable. When tanks charged directly at them at high speed, everything changed. Suddenly the Americans were closing the distance faster than gunners could adjust their aim. Suddenly the German infantry was at risk of being overrun. Suddenly soldiers who had felt safe behind their weapons were terrified and thinking about running. Abrams' tanks smashed into the German positions around Assenois like an iron fist. They drove through the town without stopping, firing at everything that moved, crushing foxholes under their treads, forcing German soldiers to choose between fighting and fleeing. Most chose to flee. The violence and speed of the assault overwhelmed defenders who had expected a cautious approach. Within minutes, American tanks were through the town and driving toward Bastogne. But the road beyond Assenois was worse than the town itself. German forces had prepared multiple defensive lines. Artillery began falling among the American vehicles. More anti-tank guns opened fire from positions that hadn't been detected. The half-tracks carrying infantry took heavy casualties. One tank was hit and began burning. Then another. The assault was grinding into exactly the kind of attritional battle that Abrams had tried to avoid. He pushed forward anyway. There was no alternative. Retreat meant that everything they had sacrificed was wasted. Caution meant that the defenders would have time to reorganize and strengthen their positions. The only option was to keep attacking, to keep moving forward, to absorb the casualties and drive through. Abrams radioed his tank commanders. "Keep moving, don't stop for anything, we stop when we reach Bastogne or when we're dead." At 4:50 p.m., 5 minutes into the assault, the lead tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion made contact with the defensive perimeter of the 101st Airborne Division. An American infantryman, half frozen in his foxhole, looked up to see Sherman tanks rolling toward his position. Tanks with white stars on their hulls. American tanks, relief at last. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The moment of contact was almost anticlimactic after the desperate fighting that preceded it. There was no dramatic meeting between generals, no speeches, no ceremony. There was simply a gap in the German ring, a corridor opened by Abrams' tanks, through which supplies and reinforcements could finally reach the surrounded paratroopers. Trucks loaded with ammunition, food, and medical supplies were already rolling forward before the shooting fully stopped. Abrams himself drove his tank into the Bastogne perimeter as darkness fell. He was covered in cordite residue and diesel fumes. His ears were ringing from hours of cannon fire. He had not slept in days. When he met officers of the 101st Airborne, he didn't give a speech or accept congratulations. He asked for a status report, checked on ammunition supplies, and began planning for the counterattacks that he knew were coming. The Germans would try to close the corridor. They would have to be stopped. The cost of the breakthrough was significant. The 37th Tank Battalion had lost multiple tanks and crews. The infantry in the half-tracks had suffered heavily. The assault on Assenois, which had taken less than 30 minutes, had produced dozens of American casualties. But the alternative, a careful, coordinated attack that might have taken hours or days, would have cost even more, not just in the assault itself but in the continuing siege of Bastogne, where men were dying every hour. The German reaction to the relief of Bastogne revealed how deeply they had come to respect and fear Abrams. Captured documents and post-war interviews paint a picture of professional soldiers who understood they had faced something extraordinary. German commanders didn't blame bad luck or superior American numbers for the breakthrough. They blamed the specific capabilities of the American colonel who had led the attack. One German after-action report described the assault on Assenois with clinical precision. The American attack came faster than anticipated, the report noted. Defensive positions were overrun before coordinated fire could be established. The speed of the American advance prevented effective use of prepared artillery concentrations. Unit cohesion broke down under the pressure of close-range tank assault. This was exactly what Abrams intended, and German analysts understood it perfectly. Another captured document specifically mentioned the commander of the 37th Tank Battalion. His tactical methods emphasized speed over firepower and aggressive action over cautious preparation. The German assessment read, "Units facing his formation should expect attacks at unexpected times with minimal warning. Standard defensive preparations may be insufficient." This was not a warning about American forces in general. This was a warning about one specific American officer. German prisoners interrogated after the relief of Bastogne confirmed what the documents suggested. They had been told to expect the 4th Armored Division. They had been told specifically to watch for the battalion commander who led from the front. They knew his name. They knew his tank's radio call sign. They had been briefed on his tactics and told how to counter them. None of it had worked. One German lieutenant, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had fought Soviet tanks for 3 years, gave the most revealing assessment. "I have faced Russian commanders who were brave," he said. "I have faced British commanders who were careful. This American was something different. He attacked like a Russian, with complete disregard for his own losses, but he coordinated like a German. We could never predict what he would do next. We could only try to survive when he attacked." In the weeks that followed, Abrams and his battalion continued to fight across Belgium and into Germany. The Battle of the Bulge ground toward its conclusion as German offensive power was exhausted and American forces pushed back everything they had lost. Abrams led attack after attack, always from the front, always with the same aggressive speed that had defined his command. His battalion's statistics continued to accumulate. By war's end, the 37th Tank Battalion had destroyed or captured more German equipment than any comparable American unit. They had advanced further, faster, and with lower casualties relative to their achievements than seemed mathematically possible. Abrams had proven that aggressive leadership at the front could achieve results that careful management from behind could not. General George Patton noticed. For all his theatrical bluster, Patton was a keen judge of military talent, and he recognized in Abrams something that transcended normal competence. "I'm supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army," Patton reportedly said, "but I have a lieutenant colonel who can run circles around me when it comes to actual fighting." Abrams is the best tank commander in the entire U.S. Army. This assessment, coming from Patton himself, was extraordinary. Patton did not easily share credit or acknowledge superiors among his subordinates. Yet the American public knew almost nothing about Creighton Abrams. Newspapers covered Patton's speeches, Patton's controversies, Patton's dramatic personality. Journalists loved Patton because he gave them stories. He slapped soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. He said outrageous things about Russians and politicians. He wore ivory-handled pistols and posed for photographs in aggressive stances. He was great copy, as the reporter said. Abrams gave no interviews. He posed for no photographs. He made no controversial statements. He simply fought day after day, leading from inside his tank, smelling of diesel fuel and cigar smoke, achieving results that would have made headlines if anyone had known about them. The contrast between fame and effectiveness could not have been starker. The war ended in May 1945, and Abrams came home to an America that barely recognized his name. There were no parades specifically for him, no movie deals, no ghost-written memoirs. He went back to being a professional soldier in an army that was rapidly shrinking as peacetime priorities took over. He married, had children, and continued his career in the quiet way he had always done everything. His post-war career was remarkable by any measure. He commanded units of increasing size and responsibility. He served in Korea. He studied at the Army War College and taught armored tactics to a new generation of officers. The lessons he had learned in the Ardennes, speed, aggression, leading from the front, became doctrine that shaped American armored warfare for decades. In 1968, Creighton Abrams received command of all American forces in Vietnam, succeeding General William Westmoreland as commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam. It was the most difficult military command in America, a war that was tearing the nation apart, an army struggling with morale, drugs, and racial tensions, a strategic situation that many believed was hopeless. Abrams approached Vietnam the same way he had approached the Ardennes, with cold analysis, systematic planning, and complete dedication to his soldiers. He shifted American strategy away from Westmoreland's large unit operations toward a more patient approach focused on securing population centers and building South Vietnamese military capability. He reformed the American advisory system. He cracked down on discipline problems that were destroying unit cohesion. He did everything that could be done by a military commander in an impossible situation. His success was limited by factors beyond his control. American political will was collapsing, peace negotiations were underway, and the fundamental strategic situation was not solvable by military means alone. But within those constraints, Abrams achieved more than most observers thought possible. The South Vietnamese military he helped train performed well in the 1972 Easter Offensive. The American withdrawal he oversaw was more orderly than critics expected. He was, once again, quietly achieving results while others received attention. In 1972, Abrams became Chief of Staff of the Army, the highest position in the service. He inherited an institution broken by Vietnam, struggling with the transition to an all-volunteer force, demoralized and underfunded. He immediately began rebuilding. He reformed training systems. He emphasized professionalism and competence over bureaucratic advancement. He laid the groundwork for the Army that would eventually win the Gulf War in 1991. He never completed the job. In October 1974, Creighton Abrams died of cancer at age 60, still serving as Chief of Staff. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, but his death received far less attention than Patton's death nearly 3 decades earlier. The general who Patton himself had called the best tank commander in the Army passed quietly, just as he had lived and fought. 6 years after his death, the Army unveiled a new main battle tank to replace the aging M60. It was the most advanced tank ever built, designed to fight Soviet armored forces in a potential World War III, incorporating technologies that made it faster, more lethal, and more survivable than any predecessor. The Army named it the M1 Abrams. The choice was deliberate and symbolic. Other tanks had been named for generals: the Sherman for William Tecumseh Sherman, the Stuart for Jeb Stuart, the Patton for George Patton. Naming the new tank for Abrams placed him in that company, an acknowledgement that he belonged among the great American military commanders even if the public had never fully recognized him. But the M1 Abrams was also specifically appropriate to its namesake in ways that went beyond mere honor. The tank embodied everything Abrams had believed about armored warfare. It was designed for speed and aggression, capable of racing across battlefields at speeds that would have seemed impossible in 1944. It carried advanced fire control systems that allowed it to acquire and destroy targets faster than any opponent. It was designed to attack, to charge forward, to overwhelm enemy defenses through violence and speed. It was, in steel and silicon, the physical expression of Creighton Abrams' tactical philosophy. When M1 Abrams tanks led the charge into Iraq in 1991, they vindicated everything their namesake had believed. American tankers attacked at night, using thermal imaging to see what Iraqi defenders could not. They advanced at speeds that shattered Iraqi defensive plans before they could be implemented. They destroyed hundreds of Iraqi tanks while suffering almost no losses themselves. Military analysts compared the Gulf War's ground campaign to Abrams' relief of Bastogne: aggressive, fast, and devastatingly effective. The soldiers who drove those tanks had mostly never heard of Creighton Abrams the man. They knew the tank's name but not the story behind it. They didn't know about the cigar-chomping lieutenant colonel who had led from the front turret of his Sherman, who had driven his tank through German positions at Assenois, who had terrified German commanders so thoroughly that they tracked his battalion by name. That history had faded, buried under the more dramatic stories of Patton and his pearl-handled pistols. The contrast between Abrams and Patton reveals something profound about military leadership and public memory. Both were exceptional commanders. Both achieved remarkable results. Both understood armored warfare at a level that few others could match. But their approaches to leadership could not have been more different. Patton commanded from headquarters and made theatrical visits to the front. These visits were photographed and publicized, creating the image of a general who shared his soldiers' dangers. But Patton never actually commanded in combat. He directed battles from maps and radios, making strategic decisions while staff officers handled tactical details. This was entirely appropriate for an army commander. Patton's job was to manage multiple corps and coordinate massive operations, not to lead individual tank charges. But the public image suggested something more direct than the reality. Abrams commanded from inside a tank, leading every attack personally, making tactical decisions under fire with enemy shells exploding around him. He never sought publicity for this. He never posed for photographs with his tank. He never gave interviews describing his experiences. The public never knew about his leadership because he never told them, and journalists never asked. Leading from the front was simply what he did, not a story to be marketed. The fame went to Patton. The movies were about Patton. The quotes that everyone remembers are Patton's. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. War is hell, but actual combat is a son of a bitch. These phrases became part of American culture, repeated by people who never read Patton's actual writings or understood his strategic thinking. Patton became the symbol of American military leadership, the archetype that later generations tried to emulate. Abrams became a tank. Not a movie, not a legend, not a cultural icon. A piece of military equipment. The irony is perfect. The man who cared nothing for fame received the most practical immortality possible. Every time an M1 Abrams rolls into battle, his name goes with it. Every tank crew that trusts their vehicle to protect them is trusting something named for a commander who trusted his vehicle the same way. The German assessments of Abrams proved more accurate than American public memory. When military historians began systematically analyzing American armored operations in World War II, Abrams emerged as one of the most effective combat commanders at any level. His tactical innovations, attacking at unexpected times, maintaining speed under fire, leading from the front to enable rapid decisions, became subjects of study at every major military academy. West Point teaches Operation Bastogne Relief as a case study in aggressive armored tactics. Instructors walk cadets through Abrams' decision to attack Assenois without artillery preparation, explaining how the calculated risk paid off because speed was more valuable than firepower in that specific situation. They discuss the psychology of his approach, how charging into enemy positions disrupted defensive plans more effectively than careful preparation would have. The comparison with Patton appears in these discussions too. Cadets learn that Patton was a brilliant strategic commander who understood how to position armies for maximum effect. They also learned that Patton's dramatic personality obscured the contributions of subordinate commanders who actually fought the battles he planned. Abrams appears in these lessons as the executor of Patton's strategy, the officer who turned plans into victories through personal courage and tactical excellence. German military historians, writing after the war ended, consistently rated Abrams among the most dangerous American commanders they faced. Their assessments carry particular weight because they had no reason to flatter. They lost the war. They were judging their own failures as much as American successes. When German professionals, analyzing what went wrong, concluded that certain American officers were exceptional, that judgment meant something. One German general, interviewed in the 1960s for an American military history project, summarized the comparison between Abrams and his more famous superiors. Patton was a force of nature, the German said. You could not ignore him, and you knew he would keep attacking regardless of cost. But Patton commanded from behind. You could track him but not catch him. Abrams commanded from the front. You could catch him, we knew exactly where he was, but you could not stop him. That was more frightening. Perhaps the deepest lesson of Abrams' story is about what military leadership actually means. The public wants heroes who look like heroes, who give inspiring speeches and pose dramatically for cameras. Military professionals want commanders who win battles while keeping their soldiers alive. These are not always the same people. Abrams brought his soldiers home alive by taking the risks himself. He led from the front because that's where decisions had to be made in armored combat. He attacked with aggressive speed because that tactic, though it seemed reckless, actually produced lower casualties than cautious approaches that gave enemies time to prepare. He calculated odds, measured costs, and made brutal decisions about acceptable losses, and his soldiers survived at higher rates than soldiers in comparable units with more cautious commanders. He was not loved the way Patton was loved. He inspired respect, not affection. His cigar-chomping silence frightened subordinates more than Patton's theatrical rages. But he brought his men home, and they knew it. Veterans of the 37th Tank Battalion, interviewed decades later, spoke of Abrams with quiet reverence. They didn't tell stories about his speeches or his charisma. They told stories about his tank leading the charge, about his willingness to share every danger, about his cold competence that somehow made them feel safe even when shells were exploding around them. When your enemy fears you above all others, when they track your movements specifically and warn their troops specifically about you, when they rate you as the most dangerous opponent they faced, that's the ultimate professional recognition. Creighton Abrams earned that recognition through cold calculation, aggressive tactics, and ruthless focus on the only mission that mattered. Winning battles while bringing his soldiers home alive. The German officers who feared him understood his achievement better than the American journalists who ignored him. The M1 tank that bears his name carries his legacy into battles he never imagined. And somewhere in the frozen memory of the Ardennes, in the snow and blood and burning metal of December 1944, the ghost of a Sherman tank called Thunderbolt still leads the charge toward Bastogne, driven by a cigar-chomping lieutenant colonel who didn't care about fame as long as his soldiers survived to tell the story.